Britain is continuing to sell arms to what has been described as rogue regimes of the Middle East. It is selling the arms under an opaque licensing system. According to a report, an increasing number of military consignments are being sold under the Open Individual Export License, or OIEL, after quiet government encouragement in 2015 despite criticism from British MPs. Under these licenses, numerous consignments can be exported to one destination under a single license for up to 5 years after initial scrutiny. They are supposed to be less sensitive goods, but campaigners say this vague requirement is often flouted.
Well, I think it actually might help this revelation MPs to actually understand and see what's going on, because what's happening is not only is the Theresa May and her government in Downing Street concealing these arms sales from the world, they're also concealing them from the press here in Britain and from the members of Parliament. We've had actually quite a lot of action from the Scottish National Party, Angus Robertson in the House of Commons, commenting on the appalling human rights record of Saudi Arabia and the fact that Theresa May seems to be breaking all her own rules by seeing Saudi Arabia as the perfect place to sell arms to.
The military and defence industry is a major player in the UK economy, and it's worth about £7.7 billion a year. But many of the countries buying the arms are run by governments whose human rights records are dark. This is while the arms sales are allegedly supposed to meet human rights standards. Two notorious regimes who are sold British weapons are Bahrain and Saudi Arabia.
Well, actually, it's quite clear that the Geneva Conventions have been completely torn up in Yemen. It's the deliberate targeting of civilians going on, and this is illegal under international law. That doesn't seem to bother Theresa May, though. I think it's important to understand what is going on in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia, because this is not really the Saudis' war. This is an American war. The Americans and the British are helping the Saudis to do something which is actually in their geostrategic interests.
The Bahraini regime has been busy cracking down on a popular uprising which has continued since 2011. The Saudis are also engaged in a devastating war on their impoverished southern neighbour Yemen.
Well, the British economy is on its knees because of the appalling economic policies of George Osborne over the last 6 years or so. Now he's gone, but also the Gordon Brown government before that, they really didn't seem to get to grips with the banksters and try and do something about the crisis of 2008. So actually it's not just Britain, of course, it's the whole of Europe and the United States that has a dying economy. So they are desperate for anything to keep the economy going, and these arms sales is an example of that desperation.
British Prime Minister Theresa May recently made a visit to the Persian Gulf region to attend a conference in Bahrain on human rights. At the meeting, she reaffirmed Britain's support, including military backing for the regional Arab states. May's visit drew criticism from British media and rights groups, with some accusing her of entering into a, quote, Faustian deal with the Arab regimes over human rights. Meanwhile, the British opposition Labour Party's leader accused May of sacrificing human rights, quote, on the altar of the arms trade. Corbyn said Saudi Arabia has committed crimes against humanity in its war in Yemen. The Prime Minister chose to travel to the Persian Gulf to negotiate arms sales to the dictatorial regimes of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, who are known for their abysmal human rights records. This now leaves the UK in a vulnerable position when it comes to human rights and its standing in the world, much less even guilty of assisting a regime that is committing war crimes in Yemen. As one of the veto-wielding members of the UN, the UK has now placed to advocate human rights abuses when it's assisting regimes that shut down newspapers and TV stations that criticise the government, use torture in response to protests, or impose the death penalty for criticising the government. The British government has defied calls to pressure the Saudi regime, in particular, over rights issues so far. Instead, London has chosen to further expand its military ties with Riyadh despite the objections to the policy.
Recent developments in Poland have shown how the country is already moving to the brink of a serious political crisis. The opposition MPs for multiple nights blockaded the parliament in protest against new press reporting restrictions imposed by the government, what they say violates the constitution. Several thousand anti-government protesters also staged a rally outside of the parliament to voice support for the opposition MPs. Similar anti-government rallies were also held in several other cities. It may be no surprise that the developments in Poland have already drawn reactions from the European Union and elsewhere.
The situation in Poland is very complex and it's primarily a domestic issue, but this domestic issue can explode and can lead to certain, political changes. And what united Poles so far was the increased Russophobia. They always, continue to say that, our enemy is Russia and we have to fight it. And as they were united in their anger at Russia, internal divisions of the country between sort of liberals and right-wingers, between Catholic government, which wants to sort of control abortions, control freedom of the press, run politics in a particular way, and the liberals, pro-European people, they were kind of moved away, but now they're coming to the surface.
Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party is already under European Union's scrutiny for policies that the opposition says are anti-democratic. The PIS, that controls both the legislative and the executive branches, came under EU fire earlier this year for rules that restricted the freedom of assembly. The Union in July gave Poland 3 months to reverse the rules or face sanctions. Nevertheless, no sanctions were eventually passed against the country, what some believe has already emboldened the country's anti-EU ruling party. Concerns are now growing that this, among other issues, could strengthen sentiments inside Poland to ditch the EU.
First of all, Poland might unravel. They might lead to sort of changes in the government. And then, they will probably decide how they want to function within EU. But my feeling is that membership in EU is not the most essential problem here, because Poland's have to bring their own house in order.
Earlier this month, Poland's former Prime Minister Donald Tusk surprised many by saying that the country had as much power as Germany to end the European Union. Tusk, who's the president of the European Council, also accused the ruling PIS party of sending negative signals to Brussels. He warned that this could undermine Poland's credibility in the EU. Such remarks are already seen as a sign of growing political rift among Polish politicians.
So there is a lot of tensions, and I think Poland being a part of it, and more or less being united with other Eastern European countries, they present a force. So that's what I think the statement is, that we're the force, we can do something. But I don't think it's his position. It's position more or less of his political opponents in Poland. I also would add that the third player in this equation is United States. That Poland are trying to be on the same length with the United States. United States used to sort of view Poland as kind of new Europe, as something which is against all Europe. But being in good terms with the United States is one thing, but being in good terms with all Europe is another. So Poland has to do a lot of soul searching to find their own way within the country and then within the Europe.
Chances may be low at the current juncture to see an end to the European Union, a scenario that emerged after the Brits voted to quit the Union. What is important in light of the developments in Poland is that certain far-right groups are more and more expressing opinions against the EU, and this could speed up the breakup of the Union sooner than later.
Western media outlets launched a full-scale media campaign a couple of weeks ago as the Syrian army was poised to liberate Aleppo, the war-torn country's second-largest city. The eastern part of the city fell to anti-government militants, among them Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra 4 years ago. The terrorist group, which was in control of eastern parts of Aleppo, was later rebranded Jabhat Fatah al-Sham at the recommendation of its foreign supporters in an effort to justify aid, including arms and ammunition, sent to the terrorist group. According to Russian officials, some 3,000 militants voluntarily decided to leave for Idlib, which is currently controlled by al-Nusra Front. But ironically enough, Western mainstream media and supporters of the militant groups, including the U.S., turned a blind eye to the presence of terrorists in the city and instead launched a media hype about what they called war crimes by the Syrian government.
They sought to denigrate the victory of the Syrian army, the liberation of Aleppo. And how did they do that? By citing sources which are completely untrustworthy. No court of law would accept the sources that Barack Obama, that Samantha Power, and that the British government have been citing.
After the liberation of the city by the Syrian government troops, more evidence is coming to light on the atrocities committed by the terrorists against the people of Aleppo, crimes against humanity which attracted no coverage by the mainstream media. The Russian permanent representative to the United Nations office in Geneva says the liberation of eastern Aleppo has proven that the allegations about atrocities committed by the Syrian army are fake. He says there is ample evidence which proves that terrorists had committed hideous crimes, like murders of children and women, and mass executions of residents of eastern Aleppo who wanted to escape. A couple of weeks ago, the UN Chief of Humanitarian Affairs, Stephen O'Brien, announced that the militants in eastern Aleppo were stopping civilians from leaving the city. There were also independent reports suggesting that the militants were using civilians trapped in Aleppo as human shields. The foreign-backed militants even sold the humanitarian food supplies to the people of Aleppo, who face starvation. Such issues, however, got little coverage by mainstream media, which preferred to highlight alleged crimes committed by the Syrian army. Some experts believe the Western mainstream media's coverage of the war in Syria, or fake news, was compromised as they have no correspondents in areas controlled by terrorists, and their local sources are not credible.
They are not credible sources. No proper, legitimate court of law would accept them as credible witnesses, as credible testimonies.
But there is another reason behind the biased coverage, and that is choice of atrocities. Many of the mainstream media outlets opted for alleged crimes by the Syrian government troops rather than atrocities committed by the anti-government militants and terrorists. That is the same approach taken by certain Western states and their regional allies who spared no efforts in supporting militant groups fighting against the Syrian government over the past 5 years. When Samantha Power, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, talked about what she called barbarism against civilians in Syria, some critics challenged her memory.
If we want to have a look at the countries who have committed heinous atrocities, heinous war crimes in, say, the last 25 years. We can go further back than that, but let's just take the last 25 years. It is, of course, America and its allies.
They just reminded her how brazenly the United States and its allies kept silent on the massacre of Palestinian women and children by Washington's strong ally in Gaza, as well as Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Beirut in 1982. And also the Saudi-led U.S.-backed invasion of Yemen, a forgotten war in which thousands of civilians have been killed and many more are dead on a daily basis amid muted response from the international community and scarce coverage by the mainstream media.